More importantly, it seems to me, she has something important to say. It's with much pleasure then that I introduce Jana Wendt.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for that introduction, and of course I'd like to thank 2BL and the ABC for giving me this opportunity, this commercial spirit that I am, to speak to really what I would regard as, I suppose, an ABC audience. Thank you so much for that opportunity. This is, of course, importantly, an evening held in memory of Andrew Olle. And I would like, at this point, to talk a little about why Andrew represented much of what I think has been lost to journalism. I was a keen listener, particularly to Andrew's last years in radio. Every morning I recall that warm voice lifted the curtain on many, many qualities. Among them, an abiding curiosity, a passion for untangling the knotted strands of politics, an indefatigable tenacity, a sensitivity, and a respect I thought that was often touchingly revealed in his conversations with artists and writers. He was prepared, it seemed to me, to be seen to be humble and vulnerable in the face of some of the creative greats who traded thoughts with him. Now, I think it's fair to say that the widespread public expressions of grief that followed Andrew's death took many people by surprise. And I think part of the reason for that surprise is the fact that those who call the shots in the media fail to comprehend that their audience, that is those people they claim to understand and for whom they devise programs, actually deeply admired those traditional and I suppose now unvoguish journalistic values. Andrew's audience recognised in the best of Andrew's work journalism as it should be. That is straight, rigorous, not propped up by bloated claims, and without resort to the superficial. Sadly, Andrew is gone, and so I believe are many of the values that he upheld. So what's happened to journalism? Well, of course, that's why I'm here. I'd like to explore that in a moment. But first, I would like to set the record straight on my own account, particularly in this company. I'm sure that in the eyes of ABC devotees, I come from the wrong side of the tracks. For many years, I worked on the top-rating commercial current affairs programs in the country. Lots and lots and lots of people watched. Over the years, I've introduced hundreds of stories to a nationwide audience, stories that comprise the bread and butter subjects of tabloid television. Consumer rip-offs, medical misfits, miracle cures, fleeing conmen, weeping victims. I've placed my foot across the sill of the aforementioned conmen and engaged in spirited stoushes with assorted scoundrels. With the benefit of hindsight, and I would hope with at least the small degree of wisdom that accrues with years, I can say now, some of those stories were valid, some were not. Some, while they didn't overstep any moral bounds, were nonetheless distorted into the cliche of good guy, bad guy, required by particular program formats. Not to put too fine a point on it, I come to this gathering more as Mary Magdalene than as the Virgin Mary. Nonetheless, I think I did some good work too. Work that I'm proud to be judged on, happy to be judged on, work that sat well, I think, in the framework of commercial television. I was rewarded handsomely, extravagantly. I was paid what my employers believed I was worth. And that reward has now bought me the most valuable commodity of all, and that is freedom. I'm able to say many things that my colleagues, still tied to one or other mighty media empire, cannot say. They are the ones, and I feel for them, who continue to work within an increasingly restrictive atmosphere. An atmosphere imposed by what has transformed ominously, I think, from journalism that is true to itself into journalism dictated overridingly by the market. There is nothing more soul-destroying than having to work at cross purposes with what you really believe. There is nothing more destructive of a journalist's talent than subordinating it to goals that have nothing to do with journalism. And yet, more and more, journalists are asked to distort their values to the perceived dictates of the market. Now, I suppose I should at this point make clear that many of my remarks will focus on television, although certainly not all. So, what is the state of journalism today? Well, I believe that at its worst, journalism, as we approach the new millennium, is contemptuous of the principles that used to form its core values. At its worst, it is deceptive in the claims that it makes to sell itself. At rock bottom, it's no better than the small-time con men it often smites with phony outrage. Principles like objectivity and fair-mindedness have been replaced by cheap opinion and popular prejudices. So why that degeneration? Well, I think because today journalism and entertainment are separated by a line as thin as a spider's trail. The old understanding that news departments should be untouchable, that is, the acceptance by media organisations that journalists have a job to do that must, if it's to have any meaning at all, must remain clear of the commercial interests of the organisation as a whole, well, that understanding has disappeared. On commercial television, the result, I think, has been the dimming of news priorities and the expansion of entertainment values into the network's information output. While considerable promotional horsepower is dedicated to pumping out large claims about the quality of news and current affairs, the reality is rather sadder and more mundane. Often the selection and order of so-called news stories bears little relation to their actual news significance. Stories trumpeted as in-depth reports are often little more than a 90-second videotape pastiche incorporating a series of fleeting faces allowed to make half statements. Not surprisingly, news and current affairs have become the worthy objects of derision. Despite some journalists' reluctance to admit it, the satirical program Frontline was based on the foundation of all pungent satire, that is, reality. It accurately, in my view, targeted the venality and the hypocrisy behind much of so-called current affairs. Unfortunately, it took satire to reveal the truth. Regrettably, it will take a lot more than laughter to fix the problem. The perversion of commercial television news and current affairs is due largely, I think, to the increased accuracy which the viewing pulse of a select group of people around the country can now be monitored. A curious black box now provides TV executives with a minute-by-minute breakdown of viewing patterns every day. If Mrs. X switched off at 6:45, there must be something wrong with the story we ran at 6:45. This is the way news editors talk. Not just something wrong with the way we did the story, but something fundamentally wrong with the subject matter. In other words, we ran a story on Aboriginal children and some viewers switched off. Now we'll think twice about running any other stories on Aboriginal children. Yes, this is the way that many news editors see the world. The fact that Mrs. X and her friends tuned out leads not to a desire to raise standards or to an acceptance that not everyone will want to watch everything that needs to be reported, but rather to a reluctance to run stories of a similar kind again. Never mind the news value, fill those ratings points. I have seen grown men staring gormlessly at maps that display the demographic breakdown of their program's audience. Close to despair, they've searched for the answer to what has become for them the only question worth answering. Why did the northern suburbs or the southern suburbs or the western suburbs turn off when we ran that story on the Middle East? Now, once upon a time in a land unspoiled by A.C. Nielsen, news editors and current affairs producers worried about news and not about demographics. They worried about whether the story on the Middle East was a good story, about whether it was a groundbreaking story. One television proprietor in those good old days actually jettisoned a high-rating American cop show and asked for a quality current affairs program to be produced in its stead. Remarkable. Today, the landscape has clearly changed. To extend the Middle East example, television news editors and current affairs producers say things like, "Who cares about the Middle East? It won't get me a single ratings point." Now, this used to be the language of the TV manager, provided, of course, he was brave enough to say it to the usually formidable executive producer who ran his program. But today, some executive producers and the managing director speak the same language and share the same faith. It is a faith that recognises profit, that is ratings, as the one indivisible God. It is a faith that has discarded all other values. It is a faith, I believe, however, which, because of its distorting effects on the quality of information people receive, that will eventually devalue the very product on which the networks rely for market ascendancy. To put it bluntly, people will no longer believe the 6 o'clock news. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest that the rot has already set in. In his most recent study on media credibility, social researcher Hugh Mackay found that people had already discounted their expectations of truth and accuracy in the media. One of the reasons, he suggested, the blurring of the distinction between information and entertainment. Credibility was hardly an issue anymore, he found, because people assumed it wasn't there. There is an upside, though, because the downgrading of news has triggered an upgrading of public relations. Almost as critical today to producing news and current affairs as the news department itself is the promotions department, the area where the sales pitch to promote stories and news programs is devised, sometimes even before the stories are done. It's not uncommon to be on your way out to do, say, a week's shooting of a story and to be asked, "What's the promo line?" Perhaps we should appeal then to the promo departments for a little honesty, something like, "On tonight's news, a grab bag of taped items which we think are graphic enough and brief enough to hold your attention." They might go on. There is no relationship between the order in which they run and their significance as news. After all, we got some great vision of Elle in a clinch with her boyfriend, and there's been a train collision in a third world country. That's at 6. Similarly, the run of small-time con men and petty crooks pursued by the current affairs programs in ritualistic style almost redefines the word cliché. But according to those who pass for sages in television, chasing baddies, however puny, sells. It sells on blue heelers, so it will sell on current affairs. Then again, if crooks are in short supply, there are always the fallback subjects, a list so ancient as to be decomposing. If all else fails, another in-depth story on back pain should fix it. You've been there, that's why. Why is it then that we journalists, as every journalist seems to know, but few of us wish to analyse, why is it that we are regarded as just about the lowest of the low on the professional totem pole? Could it be because the most prominent face of journalism is the literally incredible, screaming tabloid headline or thundering TV promo denouncing or lionising, as the case may be, somebody who probably deserves neither? Whether it's Hanson or Colston, Mother Teresa or Diana, don't we have the right to expect truth and not arid sloganeering to be at the heart of the journalist's pursuit? Should the tidal wave of trivia and sometimes downright mendacity be allowed to bury our expectations of being told the truth? Do the tabloids and their television counterparts have to be this crude to make a buck? When thousands of people around this country spoke out in admiration for Andrew Olley, they were saluting a man who at the peak of his broadcasting career could not have been further away from this mass-produced vulgarity. To refine a saying, excrement floats. Journalistic refuse often serves to conceal, in the public eye at least, the excellent work done by journalists in less hysterical newspapers and TV programs. Who, aside from the faithful viewers of the ABC's Foreign Correspondent, knows that reporter Mark Davis produced, among other high-quality work, a genuinely remarkable eyewitness story from behind the front line of the Afghan conflict? That alone with a camera, he trekked through the mine-laden Panjshir Valley with the real and constant risk of attack. Who would know about the superb, groundbreaking story on Cambodia, reported by Ross Coulthart and shown on Channel 9 Sunday programme earlier this year? I had the opportunity of seeing these stories and more, to coin a phrase, when I took part in the judging of some Walkley Award foreign reporting nominations recently. And I thought, if journalism of this type were valued by more of those who make the decisions in the media, maybe we might inch our way past insurance salesmen in public esteem. I suppose the question does have to be asked, though, does all of this really matter? Well, I would contend that it matters a great deal. Because put simply, journalists are the people on whom we rely to tell us about the world, to tell us about how we are being governed, to give us those base materials, that is facts, without which we can't make intelligent judgments about our own lives. They are there to tell us about the construction of a new freeway in our suburb as much as they are there to tell us about the slaughter in Algeria. They are there to report a local council dispute over waste disposal in Parramatta or Preston as much as they are there to report on the dispute in Kashmir. They are there because they know the difference in significance between Fergie launching diet commercials and a military coup in Cambodia. They are there because their values have not been overridden by the need to break revenue records. Now, I went into my most recent television experience with the view that it was possible to create a current affairs program whose priorities were based on those fundamental news values. A program that was not condescending to its audience, a program that could report on any story from Rwanda to rock idols intelligently. I believed it was possible to interview a movie star without slavishly doing the bidding of the star's promoters. I believed, in short, that it was possible to create a program that was good commercial television, not an imitation ABC program or Sunday in prime time, but a program made for a commercial audience with the mix of stories light and heavy that primetime commercial television demands. That's what was on offer. I believed that with a consistent adherence to news principles and a rejection of the distorted priorities that cripple the credibility of some shows, that kind of program could attract a faithful audience. I still believe that's possible. But without wishing to return for too long to that experience, it is worth recalling a highlight from my time at what was billed as a program setting new standards in current affairs journalism. It begins with what I would call television current affairs answer to Where's Wally? This is a syndrome wherein a foreign story is deemed to be worthless unless there is an Aussie angle. I was at several meetings where it was made plain by a very senior producer that the push for control of Afghanistan by the fundamentalist Taliban was not of interest unless Aussie sniffer dogs, which were at the time being used to help demine territory somewhere in Afghanistan, were found and committed to tape. Now, I would just ask you to think about that for a moment, as I did. That story about a movement whose ideology excludes girls from education, drives women out of their professions to behind the closed doors of their homes, that story would not have been done had some Aussie dogs not been found. Now, I am not saying that looking for a local angle is not legitimate. It is. But what I am saying is that making the coverage of important foreign stories live or die on whether Aussie Wally, canine or otherwise, can be located is not. But the assumptions made by that producer and others like him, I have to say, about the audience, those assumptions based, of course, on the commercial imperatives of the network, are worth examining. Television's power brokers do presume to have a handle on, amongst other things, our intelligence levels, our preferences, our concentration span, and our prejudices. And some of the assumptions they make are not flattering. In the case of Aussie Wally, the underlying assumption is that Australians are too insular or too stupid to understand foreign stories unless there's a local sweetener thrown in. All this in a country where, to misappropriate a former Prime Minister's dictum, every parrot in every pet shop is telling us we're Asian to our bootstraps. The classic viewer profile, as conceived by some TV producers, runs something like this, I think. Narrow-minded, bigoted, petty, superficial, greedy. Now, while these weaknesses may bedevil all of us some of the time, they do not bedevil all of us all of the time. I simply do not believe that the audience is a fool. I've heard too many ordinary, intelligent people over too many years mounting perceptive criticisms of the news media. And I don't mean Stuart Littlemore. Mind you, the view that I'm expressing is usually dismissed as naive by those who regard themselves as the hardheads of television. Television is a business, they say, and like any other business, the object of the exercise is to make a profit. Understood, even by me. What television executives, however, are seldom ready to acknowledge with anything other than lip service is that broadcasting carries with it a responsibility. That responsibility is greatest in the area of news and current affairs. Unlike Baywatch or The Footy Show or the best of the world's worst drivers, which are there to distract us from reality, news needs to be real. That is anchored in plain, solid fact. It needs to be free of the dumbing down that spreads like toxic gas over network programming schedules. It needs to draw a line between itself and entertainment. Australian TV executives would do well to acknowledge what the respected American current affairs producer Don Hewitt realised a long time ago. He said, "News is news and entertainment is entertainment, and crossing the line between them is often dishonest and always bad broadcasting." Just by the way, it is interesting to note that as executive producer of CBS's 60 Minutes, Don Hewitt has proved that it is possible to create a quality current affairs program for commercial television. A program that for nearly 30 years has attracted a mass audience and as a byproduct made buckets of money for the network. It is positioned in the middle of the most tabloid market in the world, and yet it succeeds. However, one of the most revealing examples, I think, of the deliberate confusion between news and entertainment was a feature interview done in the United States by one of the biggest current affairs stars on US television. In 1995, broadcaster Diane Sawyer conducted an interview with singer Michael Jackson and his wife, Lisa Marie Presley. Jackson's recording company was in the throes of a $30 million campaign for the singer's latest album, a promotional campaign. The interview was to be the first since Jackson had been accused of child molestation charges by a 13-year-old boy and settled for a figure reportedly exceeding $20 million US. It was scheduled to air as part of ABC America's Primetime Live program. It was promoted as a no-holds-barred interview. On the night, in the centre of a studio, sat the most desired interviewees of the moment with their questioner. But as it was reported subsequently, when Sawyer sat down with Jackson and Presley, there was more at stake than just a news interview. As it turned out, Jackson's representatives had shopped around for a package deal with all the networks. ABC had won the contest by agreeing to place 10 TV commercials worth between $300,000 and $1.5 million US on their network, free of charge. The following month came the announcement that ABC would also air a half-hour music program on Jackson. When the Sawyer interview aired, it incorporated extensive video clips from Jackson's record and much discussion about Jackson and Presley's married life. When you boiled it down, it was the stuff of fan magazines. The one issue the interview failed to prosecute properly was the issue of the child molestation allegations against Jackson. Sawyer even claimed that Jackson had been cleared of all charges. This, of course, was not true, with the investigation capable of being reopened at any time before the statute of limitations runs out. But in entertainment programming terms, ABC had won. 60 million people tuned in to watch. What happened to the journalism? Well, that was left far behind in the network deal-makers' rush towards the prize. The chances, under such a cosy commercial arrangement, of a proper investigation into those serious claims had to be remote from the start. Let me pose a question here. If a similar opportunity with similar strings attached arose here, which Australian commercial network would say no to an interview with Michael Jackson?
Zero.
Thank you. There are many journalists who share my concerns about the direction in which their craft is taking them, but who simply can't afford, as I mentioned earlier, to state those concerns publicly. What is disturbing, though, is that those who can, both inside and outside the media, are often cowed into silence by the fear that they may be swimming against the tide. Silenced by what the journalist Michael Ignatieff called a sullen populism. That is, a sterile mindset which demands conformity to the lowest common denominator views of those who speak loudest. It is a mindset which, according to Ignatieff, holds most forms of genuine intellectual authority in contempt. So, for the record, I believe that there is no shame in endorsing that which is good, in endorsing quality, even if that puts me at odds with the gurus and the spruikers of the market. There is no question, there is no shame in questioning the dubious merit of the homogenised output of the mainstream media, ladled out like gruel to information-hungry people. If no one speaks out, they'll forget, if they haven't already, the taste of truth. If democracy is worth our endorsement, then its value must lie substantially in its respect for individual voices. To that extent, I think the commercial media juggernaut is at odds with basic democratic principles. It only listens if you're part of the pack, if you behave like the herd, and in the case of the tabloids' front-page lynchings, if you're prepared to cheer at executions. The tabloids' headlines speak, they say, for the average man and woman. Well, I don't think so. All their primitive mantras lay bare a contempt for the very people they claim to serve. Those same so-called average people were the ones who spoke out with such voice in grief and in admiration for the journalistic principles that Andrew Olle embodied. Journalism, I think, would be greatly enriched if we were prepared more often to speak out in defence of quality and in condemnation of the mediocre. If we don't, then far from being the clever country, the expression itself a product of the spin doctor's craft just made for a pliant media, if we don't, then we will have the country we then deserve, resonating with manufactured opinions but devoid of knowledge, spouting fashionable jargon but incapable of plain speech. People fed on a diet of O.J. Simpson and the Paxtons are hardly likely to become the thinkers of the new millennium. But given that we do know that there are fine journalists in this country, capable of producing top quality work, what would it take to improve our information intake? Well, given the vast investment required to run a media business, nothing can change without the goodwill of media proprietors. Nothing can move forward unless those proprietors are prepared to acknowledge that raising the calibre of information gathering could well be the biggest single contribution they might make to the future of this country. If they are prepared to be altruistic by contributing to charities and cultural festivals, to have their name and corporate logo attached to the Festival of Sydney or the Rembrandt exhibition, why not make a real contribution on their own patch towards excellence in journalism? Is it possible in 1997 to suggest without provoking sneers that proprietors might consider taking some small, short-term commercial risks for the sake of lifting standards? Certainly, it requires courage. Certainly, it requires nerve. Crucially, I think, it requires an acknowledgement that what is being delivered up to Australians right now falls short of what they deserve. As we approach the year 2000, if television news is not to return to where newsreels at the beginning of the century began, that is, as an extension of vaudeville, and if our priorities are not to degenerate to theirs, restaging battles from the Boer War because the real ones weren't exciting enough, then Australia's media proprietors will need to make a major investment in reality. It is an investment, however, that would bring a hefty return. A nation of people capable of genuinely independent thought. After all, how much is a republic worth if its citizens are comatose? The esteemed American broadcaster Edward R. Murrow left his considerable mark on the history of broadcast journalism, first with eyewitness radio reports of the German occupation of Austria, the 1938 Munich Conference and the Battle of Britain. He then embraced and conquered the new medium of television by pioneering current affairs reporting. He brought the cruelty of apartheid to life on American TV in those years, and he produced a landmark expose of Senator Joe McCarthy. But when Murrow retired from broadcasting in 1960, he was disappointed with what it had become even then. I'd like to close with an observation made by Murrow because I think it's as potent today as it was 37 years ago. He said, "Our history will be what we make it. And if there are any historians about, 50 or 100 years from now, and there should be preserved the kinescopes for 1 week of all 3 networks, they will find, recorded in black and white, or perhaps in colour, evidence of decadence, escapism, and insulation from the realities of the world in which we live. Just once in a while," he said, "let us exalt the importance of ideas and information. Would this somehow blemish the corporate image? Will the stockholders rise up and object? I think not." Thank you.
You've been watching the 1997 Andrew Olley Media Lecture from the dining room of Parliament House, Sydney. The speaker was Jan Event.
This weekend on ABC Radio National, Martin Kriegier looks at the questions that lurk behind debates over societies and institutions. Between Fear and Hope on the Boyer Lectures, 5 o'clock Sunday afternoon on Radio National.